All right, we want to look at this session on what the Magisterium has to say about Catholic schools. And there are several documents, individual documents and bulks that I think are worth considering. First, in the 20th century, Pope Pius XI, Divini Elius Magistri, on the Christian education of youth. Secondly, from the Second Vatican Council, Gravissimum Educationis. And it's interesting with that document, it's the first time in church history that there was ever a document exclusively on Catholic education. Thirdly, we'll look at the 1983 Code of Canon Law, and then some post-Vatican II documents, what the Catechism has to say about Catholic schools, and finally, the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church. So, I'm going to start with the compendium. No one seems to, I mean, this seems to be a lost document in the Church's pile of documents after Vatican II, but it's an extremely important document. It assembles all of church teaching from Leo XIII forward onto the present moment, really, on what the church has to say in terms of her social doctrine. And so at paragraph 240, we read this: parents are the first educators, not the only educators of their children. It belongs to them, therefore, to exercise with responsibility their educational activity in close and vigilant cooperation with civil and ecclesial agencies. Now, that's a mouthful. Notice, so the first statement, that's very, very clear always, parents are the primary educators of their children. But then notice the qualifier, not the only educators. So this is an answer to the whole homeschooling phenomenon, whereby people will claim that the church says I'm the primary educator of my child. That's true. But the church goes on to say, but not the only. And there's the primary educator, then there are secondary educators. And the secondary educators, among which are the church herself and her schools. And then, because of this dual relationship that we can say between parents and those who help parents with their responsibility, it says belongs to parents then to exercise with responsibility their educational activity in close and vigilant cooperation with civil and ecclesial agencies. So if children are in a state school system, parents have to be vigilant. If they're in an ecclesial institution, likewise, the parents, in other words, they don't drop the kids off at the front door of Sacred Heart School and feel they have no other responsibility for the education of their children. There's an ongoing responsibility. And in fact, one of the problems that emerged in the late 60s and the early 70s was precisely that parents thought that they could drop the kids off and not pay attention to what was going on. And as we had, a panoply of wacky priests and nuns, most of whom left, causing all kinds of confusion and damage, parents never knew what was even going on because they presumed that they could just leave this for someone else to take care of. In the United States, the First Provincial Council of Baltimore, 1829, said this: we, meaning the bishops of the United States, judge it absolutely necessary that schools be established in which the young may be taught the principles of faith and morality while being instructed in letters. And then fast forward 65 years to the Third Council of Baltimore, we decide and decree that near each church where it does not exist, a parish school is to be erected within 2 years from the promulgation of this council. That happened between 1829 and 1884. Well, the first massive wave of immigration from Europe That first wave, largely Irish and German. And at the same time, the beginnings of the so-called nativist and know-nothing movement, who had essentially taken over all of the schools, and we need to make the point, all of these schools were essentially denominational schools, and they were explicitly and virulently anti-Catholic. And so the bishops understood the importance of having our own separate school system. In the 1917 Code of Canon Law, Canon 1374 says this: Catholic children are not to attend non-Catholic, neutral, or mixed schools. So non-Catholic, neutral, the whole idea being it takes no position on religion, or mixed. So, for example, in a place like Ireland, Protestant and Catholic together. But where no alternative to that was possible, bishops had to determine what, if any, dangers to the faith of the children existed, and parents had to petition for a dispensation to submit their children to one of those other schools. And furthermore, where there existed a Catholic school and parents were not using it, parents were threatened with excommunication. We've come a long way from that, huh? And so that today, the average Catholic, practicing Catholic even, doesn't even realize that there is a church teaching and law that says Catholic children belong in Catholic schools. In 1929, we come to Pius XI, Divini Alius Magistri, and Pius XI has this to say: the so-called neutral school, from which religion is excluded, is contrary to the fundamental principles of education. Such a school, moreover, cannot exist in practice. It is bound to become irreligious. What an insight he had, huh? The so-called neutral school, he says, why? Educationally, psychologically, it's impossible. You can't be neutral on a question of religion. And then secondly, that the neutral school, by its very nature, will move toward irreligion. And what do we have? We have the existence of the government schools, the state schools, which are not simply religiously neutral, as they may have been in the late 50s and the early 60s, but as a matter of fact, actively hostile to positions of faith and morality. And as we push forward to Vatican II, Gravissima Educationis says this, paragraph 8. The Church's involvement in the field of education is demonstrated especially by the Catholic school. Therefore, since it can contribute so substantially to fulfilling the mission of God's people and can further the dialogue between the Church and the family of man to their mutual benefit, the Catholic school retains its immense importance in the circumstances of our times too. And here's the kicker. As for Catholic parents, the Council calls to mind their duty to entrust their children to Catholic schools. When I'm invited to a parish to preach on the importance of their school, invariably I quote that line, and after Mass, dozens of parents will say, Father, I never knew that the Church said that Catholic parents were supposed to use Catholic schools. Because it's generally presented as an option. If you have a few $1,000 that you want to waste, go ahead and use it, but there's no real obligation. But that's not what the Church says, huh? In 1971, the American bishops issued a document called To Teach as Jesus Did. And in that document, we read, Catholic schools are the most effective means available to the Church for the education of children and young people. And that's not simply a kind of de fide statement. That's backed by sociology and psychology. We have all the data that proves to us repeatedly that the most effective means of catechizing and bringing into the practice of the faith is the Catholic school, up to and including the present moment. Every study demonstrates that. Now, there's a great irony in this as well, though, that in 1971, as the bishops issued that statement as a national hierarchy, at that very moment, pastors were closing schools at an unprecedented rate. In fact, we were told at the rate of one Catholic school a day in 1971. And those schools were being closed by pastors and obviously with at least a tacit approval of the bishops. So the document was wonderful, but the praxis was absolutely abysmal. In 1976, Pope Paul VI sent a bicentennial message to the Church in the United States. And within that document, he wrote this: "The strength of the Church in America is in her Catholic schools." Many people fail to realize that the system of Catholic education that we have in this country is effectively unique. There are countries, well, for example, Italy and Poland and so forth, where religion is taught in the state schools very ineffectively, but nonetheless it's there. But in terms of having, oh, Father Roman says no more? Is that, Father, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, you said how is the religion at school in Poland?
Yeah.
Not effectively?
Yeah. Is it, or?
Why?
What's that?
Why infectably?
That's what I've been told by Polish priests, that it isn't the most effective system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
You thought I said the opposite? Okay. And in '76, or at the time of the U.S. bicentennial, Paul VI canonized John Neumann, the fourth Bishop of Philadelphia. The Philadelphians call him Newman, which causes all kinds of confusion because people then think they're talking about Cardinal Newman. At any rate, he canonized John Neumann and Elizabeth Ann Seton. We can say the co-founders, really, of what became the Catholic school system in the United States. We'll talk a little bit more about that historical element later. In 1977, the Vatican Congregation for Catholic Education issued a document very cleverly called the Catholic School. Within the document, they noted that there are people in the church suggesting the phasing out of Catholic schools. This is 1977. And the conclusion of the document says, to give in to them would be suicidal. Suicidal. And of course, we see that's exactly what has happened across the board, where the schools go down, the parishes are not far behind, and certainly the whole diocesan scene is a disaster as well. Pope John Paul has rightly been called the Pope of many things, but one in particular is the Pope of Catholic Education. He was elected in '78, and in the spring of '79, he sent a message, a video message at that time, which was a unique way for a pope to present himself, to the National Catholic Education Association that was having its meeting in Philadelphia that year. And he said, "I hope to give a new impulse to Catholic education throughout the vast area of the United States of America. Yes, the Catholic school must remain a privileged means of Catholic education in America." And then that following fall, his first pastoral visit to the States, in a meeting with 20,000 Catholic high school students at Madison Square Garden, he said, "Many of you are wondering why the church expends so much time and money and energy on schools." He said, "It's to tell you why the church considers it so important for millions of young people to have a Catholic education. It's to proclaim Christ." And then frequently referred to the Catholic schools as the very heart of the church. And that became, of course, even the title of his document on Catholic higher education, Ex Corde Ecclesiae. In 2008, Pope Benedict, visiting the States, in his visit to the Catholic University of America, and it was a meeting with Catholic school administrators from around the country, two paragraphs I would point out. First, he says, "Dear friends, the history of this nation includes many examples of the Church's commitment in this regard. The Catholic community here has in fact made education one of its highest priorities. This undertaking has not come without great sacrifice. Towering figures like St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and other founders and foundresses with great tenacity and foresight laid the foundations of what is today a remarkable network of parochial schools contributing to the spiritual well-being of the Church and the nation. Countless dedicated religious sisters, brothers, and priests, together with selfless parents, have, through Catholic schools, helped generations of immigrants rise from poverty and take their place in mainstream society." And then he goes on. "This sacrifice continues today. It is an outstanding apostolate of hope, seeking to address the material, intellectual, and spiritual needs of over 3 million children and students. It also provides a highly commendable opportunity for the entire Catholic community to contribute generously to the financial needs of our institutions. Their long-term sustainability must be assured. Indeed, everything possible must be done in cooperation with the wider community to ensure that they are accessible to people of all social and economic strata. No child should be denied his or her right to an education in faith, which in turn nurtures the soul of a nation." As usual with Benedict, there's an awful lot to digest there, huh? But that second paragraph, number one, the sacrifice continues today. Secondly, he refers to the Catholic school apostolate as an apostolate of hope, addressing what? The material, intellectual, and spiritual needs of children. And then he says, this is a unique opportunity for what? The entire Catholic community to contribute. I always make this point in my preaching, is the responsibility for the Catholic education of children is not the sole responsibility of the parents, nor of the parish that happens to have a school on its property. No, it's the responsibility of the entire Catholic community. And when we look at the Code of Canon Law shortly, we'll see exactly the same point made. Very often, I'll say to senior citizen groups, when you went to Catholic school, it was either free or almost free. When your children went, it was a nominal tuition. And now it's reached the point where it is inaccessible to very many middle-class families. I'll give you an example. The high school that I went to was at the time a brand new, very small parish high school. My freshman year of high school, the tuition was $150. By the time I graduated, and the whole school was only 186 kids at the time, the tuition was $300. The tuition today, the enrollment today is about 800, and the tuition is about 14,000. This is unconscionable. Among other things, we're putting ourselves out of business. We'll talk more when we go to that section on Thursday about finances. And now let's take a look at the Code of Canon Law. What does the law say? What is canon law? If there are any canon lawyers on board with us, I'm going to say this. Canon law is theology put into practice, all right? And there is a whole series of canons, starting with 793 up to 806, dealing precisely with Catholic education. So, 793, paragraph 1. Parents and those who take their place are bound by the obligation and possess the right of educating their offspring. Catholic parents also have the duty and right of choosing those means and institutions through which they can provide more suitably for the Catholic education of their children according to local circumstances. Paragraph 2. Parents also have the right to that assistance to be furnished by civil authority, which they need to secure the Catholic education of their children. And here is the whole point about parental freedom of choice in education. This topic comes up repeatedly in church documents, starting at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think when we talk about school choice options tomorrow afternoon, you'll see there'll be more discussion about that. But in other words, what the church teaches and what has been universally understood by public law is that parents have a right to choose, but that right cannot be conditioned by the ability to pay. It would be very similar to, for example, the situation in the Deep South prior to the Civil Rights era, where blacks were free to vote. However, if you wanted to vote, there was what was called a poll tax. You had to pay $5 or $10 or whatever to vote. And so your ability to vote was conditioned by your ability to pay. And as has been noted judicially, a civil right penalized is a civil right denied. So then Canon 794. The duty and right of educating belongs in a special way to the church, to which has been divinely entrusted the mission of assisting parents, or excuse me, assisting persons, so that they are able to reach the fullness of the Christian life. So notice the church's understanding of education. It's to bring people to the fullness of the Christian life. And that the right of education belongs in a particular way to the church. Why? Because the church is, as that encyclical of John the 23rd put it, mater et magistra. The church is both a mother and a teacher, and she's a teacher in a preeminent way. 794, paragraph 2. Pastors of souls have the duty of arranging everything so that all the faithful have a Catholic education. So it's a responsibility, and when the code uses the word pastors, it means, first of all, bishops, and then secondly, the delegates of bishops, namely the parish priest. So it's a responsibility for the clergy to ensure the Catholic education of all children. 795. Since true education must strive for complete formation of the human person that looks to his or her final end, as well as to the common good of societies, children and youth are to be nurtured in such a way that they are able to develop their physical, moral, and intellectual talents harmoniously, acquire a more perfect sense of responsibility and right use of freedom, and are formed to participate actively in social life. If your parish school is looking for one of those silly mission statements, right? But if you need one, here it is right there. What's the purpose of Catholic education? To develop the physical, moral, intellectual talents harmoniously so that children acquire a more perfect sense of responsibility and the right use of freedom, and then can participate actively in social life. I neglected to highlight a point from Benedict's talk at Catholic U, where he says, an education in faith nurtures the soul of a nation, right? Wonderful expression, huh? That the social fabric is aided by faith-based education. And this is the point that's also made in this canon. By the way, I think you should be able to upload these canons. I think they should be available to you there. 796, paragraph 1. Among the means to foster education, the Christian faithful are to hold schools in esteem. Schools are the principal assistants to parents in fulfilling the function of education. Paragraph 2. Parents must cooperate closely with the teachers of the schools to which they entrust their children to be educated. Moreover, teachers, in fulfilling their duty, ought to collaborate very closely with parents who ought to be heard willingly and for whom associations or meetings are to be established and highly esteemed. Notice what's being talked about here, the close cooperation between home and school. So parents are submitting their children to the Catholic school. That's wonderful. That's the first step. But they are to cooperate with teachers, which means, among other things, reinforcing in the home environment what's being taught in the school. Flip side, teachers do not arrogate to themselves the rights of parents. They cooperate with parents. They listen to the legitimate concerns of parents. And John Coleman from the University of Chicago did a major study on the success of Catholic high schools in the country. And among other things, he said, the prime indicator of the reason for success is the intense cooperation between home and school that exists in the Catholic school environment. I've had teachers tell me who for years taught in public schools, and then one woman said, I teach in a public school so my kids can go to Catholic school. And then she says, as soon as I get my retirement benefits, I'll teach in a Catholic school. And this woman said to me, her first homeschool meeting as a Catholic school teacher was a shock to her. I said, what was the shock? She said, when we had homeschool nights in the public school, 3 or 4 parents would show up. She said, I opened the doors of my classroom that first night. I had 30 parents standing outside the room. So that, again, that intense cooperation, and that's the key to success. 797, parents must possess a true freedom in choosing schools. Therefore, the Christian faithful must be concerned that civil society recognizes this freedom for parents and even supports it with subsidies. Distributive justice is to be observed. We see an example of that in constitutional jurisprudence this past week, 2 weeks ago rather, with the Supreme Court decision about voucher programs or tuition tax credits or whatever, aiding parents in making that freedom of choice. And again, we'll talk about that more tomorrow. 798. Parents are to entrust their children to those schools which provide a Catholic education. If they are unable to do this, they're obliged to take care that suitable Catholic education is provided for their children outside the schools. There are countries where the access to Catholic education is minimal. Although it's interesting that in many of the so-called mission countries, and Father Andrew can tell us about this, people are desperate to get their children into Catholic schools because of the high quality of the Catholic schools, academically, but also morally. 799. The Christian faithful are to strive so that in civil society, the laws which regulate the formation of youth also provide for their religious and moral education in the schools themselves, according to the conscience of the parents. Now, this is a rather unrealistic canon, at least in terms of a pluralistic society. Frankly, I don't want the government schools to be involved in the moral formation of children, right? Because we know what it's going to be. It's going to be immoral and amoral. If you have a homogeneous society, so if you're talking about a place like Malta, which is still 98% Catholic, that may mean something there. But certainly in this culture, it would be fraught with all kinds of possibilities. And of course, we know that there is, quote, moral education going on, and it's immoral. Canon 800, paragraph 1, the Church has the right to establish and direct schools of any discipline, type, and level. So this is an answer to civil authorities, huh? And here we have to make an historical observation. When a totalitarian government takes over a country, it doesn't close churches first. It closes religious schools, all right? Because that's the first line of opposition. Whoever rocks the cradle rules the world, huh? So if you have an influence of the education of children, then you have the opportunity to do or to undo what's happening in a societal vein. Paragraph 2, the Christian faithful are to foster Catholic schools, assisting in their establishment and maintenance according to their means. Notice here, the Christian faithful, that's all of God's people, are responsible for the establishment and the maintenance of Catholic schools. The point I made earlier, not simply parents, not simply a parish that happens to have a school on its property, right? It's the responsibility of every single Catholic. And where that notion is in place, the Catholic education thrives. A wonderful example of this is the little diocese of Wichita, Kansas, which for over 30 years has had a free Catholic school system, K to 12, right? Schools packed, and will you be surprised to discover little Wichita for the past 10 years has ordained 10 men a year. 100 priests in 10 years. Where are they coming from? They're coming from the Catholic school system, right? Conversely, you have some of the largest dioceses in the United States that are priest poor, disgracefully so. If you take in the New York metropolitan area, the three so-called downstate dioceses of New York, Brooklyn, and Rockville Center, which have a combined Catholic population of about 7.8 million Catholics, right? Among them, in the past several years, they have not ordained 10 men, all right? Monsignor Batul is on the faculty of that interdiocesan seminary. Why? Well, where are the kids, where is the Catholic education of the kids occurring? In fact, what you witness is year after year, more and more and more closures. And you can't expect any kind of positive results. This is also a point in terms of the Hispanic community. It's been a bugaboo of mine for decades now to say the failure of the church in the United States with Hispanic Catholics is the first time in the history of the church in this country where we have abandoned even the attempt at Catholic education of children. When the waves of immigration occurred in the end of the 19th century with the Irish and the Germans, and the beginning of the 20th century with the Italians and the Eastern Europeans, every one of those kids was given the opportunity for a Catholic education. I am the grandson of 4 immigrants, right? And I have 2 doctorates, right? This is what the Catholic school system did. And we asked the question with the Hispanics, we say, why are they all leaving the church? Is it what, 50%, at least 50% defection rate of Hispanic immigrants? And why no native Hispanic vocations? We have to import them from Colombia and Peru and God knows where else, right? Well, look in the mirror, church, right? We're not providing for the Catholic education of this generation and therefore alienated from the church, so from the general practice of the faith, let alone from providing vocations. But the underlying point, the responsibility of the entire community. And how is Wichita able to deal with this? They have a very, very effective stewardship program so that any parishioner who is a regular Mass attendee and contributes to the upkeep of the parish is entitled to the free education of their children. Again, we'll talk more about this when we look at school finances. Canon 801. Religious institutes whose proper mission is education, retaining their mission faithfully, are also to strive to devote themselves to Catholic education through their schools, established with the consent of the diocesan bishop. Now, Monsignor Shadle is privy to a scene in his archdiocese where a religious community, surprise, surprise, the Jesuits, have claimed that they're not answerable to the diocesan bishop, right? In point of fact, they are, and we'll see several more canons that talk specifically about this point. A religious community that wants to establish a school must obtain the consent of the diocesan bishop, and their continuing as a Catholic school is at the direction or the approval of the diocesan bishop. They're not free agents to do what they please, because the ultimate arbiter of the Catholicity of a school is the diocesan bishop. He is the principal teacher. Monsignor, do you have anything to say about that?
I have a lot to say about that. but I'm not sure that you want to hear it now. But it's a royal mess, and as you know, right now it's at the Vatican, waiting on a ruling. But our dear Archbishop has suffered a lot because of his stance on that.
Yeah. 802.
Oh, by the way, Peter, on the front page of the newspaper this week, there's an article about a Lutheran school here in Indianapolis, which has done the same thing.
Oh.
And so we're in good company, even if it's with the Lutherans.
Yeah. And of course, with the Supreme Court decision last week, apart from the previous week, it's now clear that the church has the right to consider all her teachers as ministers and therefore entitled to the ministerial exception. So we have a right to hire and fire teachers according to the principles of our own theology. Paragraph 2. Where it is expedient, the diocesan bishop is to make provision for the establishment of professional schools, technical schools, and other schools required by special needs. And this is an area where the church has dropped the ball tremendously in the post-Vatican II era. Technical schools. The Salesian Fathers were wonderful for running these in the old days. They still have a few of them in this country, but not every Catholic kid is apt material for an academic, college-bound education, right? But those kids still need an education sponsored by the church. And in the other area, children with special needs. And again, we had a number of these for until the 60s and 70s, and then they all sort of disappeared as well. And so the presumption is that if a child has special needs, well, let the government schools take care of them. And that's a failure on the part of the church. Canon 803, paragraph 1. A Catholic school is understood as one which a competent ecclesiastical authority or a public or ecclesiastical juridic person directs, or which ecclesiastical authority recognizes as such through a written document. So, a parish can establish a school, and that school is an integral part of the juridic person of that parish. Or, for example, a group of lay people on their own initiative can decide to start a school with a Catholic ethos and so forth, and then present that project to the diocesan bishop for his approval, at which point they can then use the word Catholic in their promotional material. But without that approval of the bishop, it can't be done. Very often, you'll find that there are groups of lay people who do this, and a diocesan bishop doesn't want to get into something that he doesn't know where it's going to end. And so he'll say, well, do this on your own, and we'll see where it goes. And so their literature will say a school in the Catholic tradition, all right? And then at a certain point, as a matter of fact, a bishop will then say, oh, this looks like it's working and it's going in the proper direction. Fine, I'll give my imprimatur to it. A good example of that is in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, what are called the Regina schools, which started out as independent Catholics. Each one has a title of Our Lady, Regina Angelarum, Regina Pacis, and so forth. And they started these schools on their own initiative, very, very strong Catholic ethos to the schools, a strong academic classical approach to education. And then when Archbishop Chaput took over Philadelphia, they invited him to their school, to one of their schools, and they said, we would like to know if you would acknowledge these as Catholic schools. And he said, you mean they're not? And he didn't know. And he said, well, they are now. And they're a great success story. They have about 5 or 6 of them now. And in fact, one of them is now even involved with, it's an entity within one of the diocesan high schools for a classical curriculum within the overall curriculum of Cardinal Doherty High School. The same canon, paragraph 2, the instruction and education in a Catholic school must be grounded in the principles of Catholic doctrine. And here's the kicker line. Teachers are to be outstanding in correct doctrine and integrity of life. This was one of the items used by the Supreme Court last week in saying the church is the one that defines what a Catholic school teacher is. And here's what it says: outstanding and correct doctrine and integrity of life. So if the person is not living according to Catholic standards or promoting something that's anti-Catholic, that person is not an apt candidate to be teaching in a Catholic school. And the church has both the right and the obligation to determine that this teacher ought not to be there. And now, thankfully, we have that enshrined also in American law. I would use this as an opportunity also to make this point, namely, you've got to make sure that your teacher contracts are ironclad. This canon needs to be quoted, all right? So that everyone knows coming in and in possibility of exiting what the expectations are. Because if you need to fire a teacher for a morals reason, you better be sure that you have a contract that makes that clear from the beginning. So this person can't say, I didn't know that. I only found out about that when the principal or the pastor went after me. Paragraph 3. Even if it is in fact Catholic, no school is to bear the name Catholic without the consent of competent ecclesiastical authority. The point I just made. Canon 804. The Catholic religious instruction and education, which are imparted in any schools whatsoever, or are provided through the various instruments of social communication, are subject to the authority of the Church. It is for the Conference of Bishops to issue general norms about this field of action, and for the diocesan bishop to regulate and watch over it. Now here we're talking about something that doesn't apply to the United States. They're talking about situations in which religion is taught in the state schools. But even if that is the case, once again, the church has the authority to determine what is the curriculum that's going to be taught. And we find this in a number of the countries of Europe still. France, Spain, Italy, Poland, where religion is taught in the state schools. But we have to ensure that it is properly taught. And Italian priest friends tell me it's a debacle of the first order in Italy because the courses are not taken seriously, the priests are made fun of, and so forth. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work in the contemporary environment. A number of years ago, I participated in a conference in Barcelona, international conference on education. And I made the point that, this is about 15 years ago, I said, countries that have this rather cushy relationship with the state, whereby religion is taught in the state schools, ought to be very, very careful and start looking toward the future where that arrangement is either going to be violated or misused. And therefore, they ought to start to look at what we did 200 years ago, namely of starting a separate school system entirely. And that doesn't even guarantee complete freedom, as we can see with the Canadian situation, which is a terrible mess for Catholic education. The second paragraph of 804. The local ordinary is to be concerned that those who are designated teachers of religious instruction in schools, even in non-Catholic ones, are outstanding in correct doctrine, the witness of a Christian life, and teaching skill. So again, if you have an arrangement, a civil arrangement that has teaching of religion in non-Catholic schools. 805. For his own diocese, the local ordinary has the right to appoint or approve teachers of religion, and even to remove them or demand that they be removed if a reason of religion or morals requires it. And of course, this is precisely the case in the Indianapolis situation, where you had two Catholic school teachers, men married to each other, and And the Catholic schools said, this can't exist. The diocesan school, right, said it can't, and the Jesuits supported the arrangement, right? And the bishop said it can't exist. 806, paragraph 1, the diocesan bishop has the right to watch over and visit the Catholic schools in his territory, even those which members of religious institutes have founded or direct. He also issues prescripts which pertain to the general regulation of Catholic schools. These prescripts are valid also for schools which these religious direct, without prejudice, however, to their autonomy regarding the internal direction of the schools. So notice, as the chief teacher of a diocese, the bishop has the responsibility to watch over and, catch this, visit the schools. Visit them, right? And this is noted in the breach more than the observance. Some friends of mine who are administrators of a diocesan high school invited their new ordinary to come to the school for Catholic Schools Week, celebrate Mass for the kids, and spend the day visiting classes and so forth. And so at the end of the Mass, the principal said to the bishop, now, Joe and Mary are going to take you on a tour of classrooms. And the bishop said, whoa, what are you talking about? And he said, well, we're going to visit classes. Well, I came to say Mass. And he said, well, no, we thought you were coming to visit classes, and the student council is hosting a luncheon for you. Oh, he said, no, I came for Mass. And he said, well, what about the kids can have a nice lunch. And he walked out, right? This is the level of interest, all right, of a diocesan bishop. Bishop read Canon 806. You are supposed to be involved in these institutions. And then, of course, they're often the first ones then to complain. I didn't know that was going on there. Well, as we used to ask the political question in the 70s, if you didn't know, you should have known, all right? Why do not know, all right? But that a bishop wouldn't want to spend time visiting his Catholic schools. Paragraph 2 of 806, directors of Catholic schools are to take care, under the watchfulness of the local ordinary, that the instruction which is given in them is at least as academically distinguished as that in the other schools of the area. In other words, we talk about Catholic schools. What's the noun? The noun is school. It's got to be an excellent academic institution, all right? The adjective is Catholic. It's modified by that, all right? That adds to, it doesn't subtract. So a Catholic school is not simply a Bible vacation school. It's not an exaggerated CCD center. It's a real school with extremely high academic standards, so that, as the canon says, they're at least as good as the other schools, at least as good. Now, for the most part in the United States, our schools are not as least as good. They're far superior. And in the city situation, that's no question whatsoever. So those are the relevant canons. Any questions about those in particular before we push forward? Okay. And then just a few observations from a couple of other documents. 1997, again, the Congregation for Catholic Education issued a document called The Catholic School on the Threshold of the Third Millennium. And in paragraph 2, they speak of this. New requirements have given force to the demand for new contents, new capabilities, and new educational models besides those followed traditionally. Sometimes you'll hear people saying, well, today's Catholic schools ain't what they were in 1950. Well, I hope not, all right? It's not 1950, all right? It's not Leave It to Beaver and Little House on the Prairie. So the social situation has changed. Standards of all kinds have changed. But notice, it's not destroying the traditional identity. It's taking cognizance of new circumstances and applying that tradition to the new circumstances. So if we were to do exactly what we did in 1950, we would not be faithful to our commission to be effective Catholic educators today. Because in 1950, you could take an awful lot of things for granted that you can't take for granted today, just in terms of the family life of children. In the third paragraph, such an outlook calls for courageous renewal on the part of the Catholic school. The precious heritage of the experience gained over the centuries reveals its vitality precisely in the capacity for prudent innovation. Prudent innovation. As so, now as in the past, the Catholic school must be able to speak for itself effectively and convincingly. It's not merely a question of adaptation, but of missionary thrust, the fundamental duty to evangelize, to go towards men and women wherever they are, so they may receive the gift of salvation. Notice the linkage between the existence of a Catholic school and the work of evangelization. In some instances, that will be the first evangelization. So, Father Andrew, what generation of Catholic are you? We turn up, we can't hear you. Your voice is off.
Yeah, what you mean the generation I am from in Cameroon?
What generation of Catholic are you?
Oh, the Catholic Church arrived in my country in the early 19th century, and we are of the 20th century.
Okay. So your parents and grandparents were Catholic?
Yes.
Okay. Cardinal Lorenze, for example, the former prefect for divine worship, he's a first-generation Catholic, and he's a Catholic because he went to Catholic school. And interestingly enough, was taught by a priest who is now a blessed, a Trappist monk. And so that's the work of the first evangelization. What we're talking about in our situation is either re-evangelization or reinforcing the work of evangelization. In the 1950s, I think the average Catholic school in this country could see its primary responsibility as catechesis, not evangelization, right? That's the second phase, right? We can't take that for granted today. Paragraph 6. The school is undoubtedly a sensitive meeting point for the problems which besiege this restless end of the millennium. Imagine what they would say today. To this we must add, on the part of numerous pupils and families, a profound apathy where ethical and religious formation is concerned, to the extent that what is in fact required of the Catholic school is a certificate of studies, or at the most quality instruction and training for employment. So very often we'll hear parents say, if they're honest, that the reason they're putting their kids in a Catholic school is because of good academics or discipline or a safe environment. Those are not evil things, Those are, if I were a parent, I would want all those things for my children, right? But we have to do all of that plus, and this is where the pedal hits the metal, And as long as the parents are not obstructing what's going on in the school environment, then we have a reasonable hope that our work of evangelization and catechesis will take root. And again, as I said in the first session, that even a process of reverse evangelization can occur. Paragraph 8 of that document. Thus, the Catholic school should be able to offer young people the means to acquire the knowledge they need in order to find a place in society which is strongly characterized by technical and scientific skill, but at the same time, it should be able, above all, to impart a solid Christian formation, right? So yes, we do all of that, and we do it very, very well, but not to the exclusion of this other. And in fact, I always make the point, we're able to do all of that other stuff well, precisely because of our faith commitment, right? That's what provides the entire environment. Paragraph 10. The social and cultural context of our time is in danger of obscuring the educational value of the Catholic school in which its fundamental reason for existing and the basis of its genuine apostolate is to be found. And what's the fundamental reason for the existence of the school, of the Catholic school? A number of years ago, I took over a high school. As those of you who are priests know, you get a reputation in the church for being Father Fix-It. And so you get sent to a dump every time to fix, and you fix, and then you leave, and it's all messed up 10 minutes after you leave. At any rate, this school was a terrible mess. And the first day I had a school assembly in the gym, and I began by saying, ladies and gentlemen, this school exists for one reason and one reason alone, that everyone here become a saint. And this voice screamed out from the bleachers and said, I ain't no saint and I don't want to be one. I said, whoever just shouted that down center court, front and center, number one, you better learn some grammar while you're here. Number two, that you ain't a saint, that's pretty clear. That you don't want to be one, we have a problem, mister. Right? Because if you don't want to be, then you have no business being in this school. And anyone else who follows his example, form a procession right now and go stand outside my office, and we'll transfer you to the public dump down the block in 2 hours. Wow. Silence. It turned out, of all things, that he was the quarterback for the football team. And we ended up becoming very, very great friends. But that attitude, he embodied an attitude that was very prevalent in that student body, and that was allowed to take root and control an ethos of an entire school. We were able to change that. And in fact, my 4 years there, we sent 7 boys to the seminary, all of whom became priests. But we have to have things very, very clear. This is what we're about. And if we're not about that, then we ought to close up tomorrow. That same paragraph goes on to say, there's also been a noticeable tendency to reduce education to its purely technical and practical aspects. All this STEM education business, okay? Pedagogy and the sciences of education themselves have appeared to devote greater attention to the study of phenomenology and didactics than to the essence of education as such, centered on deeply meaningful values and vision. This process tends to make the school step back into a supposed neutrality, which enervates its educating potential and reflects negatively on the formation of the pupils. In other words, we're not producing automatons, all right? We're producing human beings. We're aiding in the formation of human beings. And if the human dimension, if the humanum, if the humanitas is absent, then we're missing the boat on what we mean by education in general, let alone Catholic education. A correct pedagogical approach ought to be to open to the more decisive sphere of ultimate objectives, not only to how, but also to why. Overcoming any misunderstanding as regards the claim to neutrality in education. Restoring to the educational process the unity which saves it from dispersion amid the meandering of knowledge and acquired facts, and focuses on the human person in his or her integral, transcendent, historical identity. Again, facts are critically important, but you can get facts by Googling, right? That's been one of the things I hope we've learned with this pandemic, is that this so-called distance education is not only not ideal, it's long-term, it's detrimental. And when you even hear kids say they want to be back in school, you know that something is profoundly wrong with what's been going on. Paragraph 14. The endeavor to interweave faith and reason, right? John Paul's Fides et Ratio, which has become the heart of individual subjects, makes for unity, articulation, and coordination, bringing forth within what is learned in school a Christian vision of the world, of life, of culture, and of history. So Christian education provides students with a prism with a worldview, so that there is a Christian take on history. There's a Christian take on science, all right? Now, 2 + 2 is always 4, regardless of what Father Spadaro in Rome would tell you. But the science is there. That's true. But what do we do with that? All right. And Sister Mary Elizabeth is going to talk about that relationship between faith and science tomorrow. So that there is a distinct, unique Christian take on reality. Faith is not seeing. Some people have this strange idea that, it means not seeing things. No. That's not faith. Faith is seeing according to a corrected vision. All right. It's faith is giving us the optics by which to view reality from the divine perspective, rather than from a deformed post-original sin optic. All right. If I take my natural sight is impeded, I need to wear glasses. If I take off the glasses, things are blurred. I put the glasses on, I see clearly. That's what faith does in the life of a person. It clarifies vision and enables us to see things according to a divine perspective, rather than from a depraved or perverted human perspective. And then finally, paragraph 17. A correct relationship between state and school, not only a Catholic school, is based not so much on institutional relations as on the right of each person to receive a suitable education of their free choice. So again, we'll talk about this more when we look at school choice options, but what's the responsibility of the government in terms of school? It's to ensure the education of children, not that they provide it, but that it be provided, and that the state assists in that, most especially from a financial perspective. So I think that's where I might want to leave this section. Sister Elizabeth Ann, do you have great insights to with us all?
I don't know about insights, but I have a few comments. First of all, I'm just thank you for the clarity of that.
I'm sorry?
Thank you for the clarity with which you presented the canons and the documents and forged those connections. I think that was outstanding. But there were about 4 points that came to me during your discussion that I kind of stand in amazement at. One is the need for parental education and formation. And priestly formation too, for that matter. You said that when you talked about priests, and you're talking about the duty of a pastor to provide for the education of his parishioners. And you had seminarians say they didn't even know that. They never heard that canon. You can say the same thing about parents. You're the primary educator of your student. You're not the only educator of your child. And it will be a revelation to them. So somewhere the ball has been dropped, where we've got some remedial work to do with parents. I've been teaching for 52 years, something like that.
You started right after your first communion.
I really and truly did, because I'd only been Catholic 2 months when I started teaching. So I always say I started when I was 2, but even that's getting to be old now. But the religion books of that era, which are where the grandparents and parents of these kids are educated, were very appealing and very beautiful and almost totally devoid of doctrine. And I think we're reaping that gap. you can't give what you don't have, basic premise. So when parents lack the proper formation, or it's hard for them to give it to their children. They didn't receive it themselves. So the school has to make up that gap, and the parish has to make up that gap. That's one observation. Secondly, the very qualities of our culture that make the Catholic school so necessary for the soul of the country, or so necessary for the lives of children, are the very characteristics that make it harder to do. Like parents, for example, I had this woman pleading for financial aid. And I listened and I said, yeah, really, Father handles that. Let me set up the appointment for you to discuss it with Father. And we'll help you in any way we can. So I called Father. He said he can see you next week. And she said, oh, since for next week we're taking the children to Disney World. They understand right. They don't understand duty. You know, and Canon Law provides for both. It's the right of the parent. It is also the duty of the parent to provide Catholic education. And the documents could not be clearer. The third point, and this is a song I sing a lot, and you said it perfectly. It is the whole church's responsibility to educate the children. It's not just the people who happen to have the children right now. And I think that somehow that sense of identity and sense of common responsibility has been, in this age of materialism, greatly diminished. And anything we can do to help priests, the parish in general, really back education and Catholic education would be a great favor for this whole country. We'll tell this story tomorrow, but so you can go to sleep now or you can go to sleep tomorrow, either way. You don't have to listen to it twice. But I had just arrived at a school as principal, parish school. It was, in the South, it's euphemistically called undergoing a demographic shift. So basically, the macro culture was moving out and the minority culture was moving in. A lot of the kids weren't Catholic, but many of them are now Catholic. And there was a high school nearby that was diocesan high school. That's where the kids went. So each parish was charged a subsidy to help with the tuition, the number of children from that parish who went to that school. And the finance chairman, the chairman of the finance board, they're never pro-school people, very rarely. If you can make them pro-school, you've done a great service. So he was saying that subsidy is over the top. That is ridiculous for us to have to pay that subsidy. And this is an aging parish, and we need things for our elders. We have lots of working parents. We need things. On and on and on. And the pastor this was my first parish council meeting in that parish. And the pastor just sat there and he didn't say anything. And I said, good grief, say something. So finally he said, you know what, I've been listening to what you said. Oh no, I'm going home now because we're going to get nowhere. He said, if you'll give me a better way to invest $100,000 than in the future of the church, I'll do it. That's the kind of stand we need people to take. There was no answer to that. There's no better thing we can do with money than to invest it in the future of the church, or our energies, or our talents, or our time, or our interest, or our energy. That's why we do what we do. It's to populate heaven and to guarantee the future of the church. So I think we need a large dose of fortitude so that we're not self-peddling ourselves. This is a serious business. We have a society that is materialistic and individualistic and hedonistic and relativistic, and none of those are good things. And we're trying to help form young people to be what the document on laity calls the great community of the church. And that's why the clerical witness is so important, because we cannot witness to the whole church without the whole church being present. So if the kids never, that same pastor who said, about the investment, about the subsidy, he would come over and hand out every report card to the 400 kids in that school. Every report card. He would set dismissal 3 times a week. He said math on Fridays for the kids. There was always math, but Fridays were to the children to math. He trained the altar boys and later girls.
Oh, well.
Can't win them all. But, he was at every sacramental preparation meeting, even the ones he was not responsible for giving. Nothing substitutes for your presence. Nothing. Because we can't. And I think that what did our Lord leave us? His presence. That's what he left. And so we have to learn from there. But the schools are not ancillary to evangelization. They are key to evangelization. They share in that mission. And so, and that's why it's so, Catholic schools are so whole and so integral. If they're really Catholic schools, they form the whole person. And they don't have some category, we don't segment kids. And the document, I think it's in the one on intercultural understanding. It says that in the Catholic school, there is no separation between time for instruction and time for formation. We're always forming. And those canons and those documents, they say those same things over and over again. So it's obviously, we got our challenges, but we know we're on the right track.
All right, Sister, I have just to piggyback on a few things. First, I have a question. All of your years teaching and running schools in the South, Did children have difficulty understanding your Brooklyn accent?
Well, I just tell them I'm upstate New York, and they understand. I forget I have one.
Two points that Sister mentions. The importance of parent formation. We've got a generation of parents populating our schools right now who were never properly parented themselves, right? They don't know what they're doing. And many of them know that they don't know what they're doing. And so when I do school evaluations, one of my first recommendations always is that there be a program of parent formation that is required, that's required. At least a quarterly meeting of parents on some aspect of the Christian family, the nature of child psychology, I mean, whatever. Because these poor parents are rudderless, all right? Now, initially, there may be resistance, huh? We see this, for example, in pre-Cana programs. You know, you hear them say, who wants to go to that thing? And by the second session, they're saying, you know, that was really pretty good, right? And I always stress the importance of, we're not simply educating one generation, where we have the opportunity and therefore the obligation to educate the parent generation as well, so that there is more consonance between what we're doing with the kids in school and what the atmosphere of the home is, right? In terms of discipline, in terms of priorities, all of these issues. You know, it always used to irk me when a mother would bring a kid to me in high school that had been in public school for 8 or 9 years, and she'd say, now, he's out of control completely, Father, and you can do whatever you need to do to take care of this problem. Whack him, wait a minute. If you had whacked him when he was 2, he wouldn't be a problem when he's 13, all right? Don't ask us to do the job that you should have been doing all along. But here again, the importance of 2 generations at the same time being educated. And then, sisters, other point, it's the common responsibility of the church, of the whole church, right? So one of the mistakes that was made innocently, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s, was parish budgets separating the school budget from the rest of the parish budget. Psychologically, what is that suggesting? That this is a separate entity. The priests who are participating know on the pre-survey, I ask them, is your school on your parish website, all right? If it's not, it suggests that it has an identity all its own, all right? The other problem with common sense of responsibility for a school is this regionalization process that has gone on in all too many dioceses. So that, yeah, there may be a school on this property, but no one has a sense of ownership. And I don't mean property ownership, all right? But a sense of, this belongs to us. This is our concern. We're invested in this, all right? And so what's the responsibility of everybody is the responsibility of nobody. And we can't expect the financial support. We can't expect the psychological support, the institutional support for something that no one is really responsible for. And the first place where that breaks down is with the clergy. Because, so is there a board of pastors? Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, all right? Or it shifts from year to year between Father X and Father Y and so on. But who's really responsible for this entity that's sitting on a piece of real estate? And the people in parishes don't feel an identity or an identification, I should say, with that institution. And it always amazes me that, you know, this clustering, regionalization, whatever euphemism it's used for, you know, this has been known to be a failure since the late 1970s, and we keep doing it. And, you know, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. You know, there's a diocese that just 2 weeks ago announced the closure of 10 schools, all right, 5 of which had been merged 5 years ago, all right? Doesn't work, wake up, all right? So, all right, any of you gentlemen have any questions or comments, observations before we take a little bit of a break? Yes, Father.
I want to thank you for the input and for the presentation on what the church says about Catholic education. It's so rich and so interesting, really, to hear from you. I would like to ask a question, especially from your experience. What I must confess that I know very little about the Catholic education in this country, but it seems to me
I should
that
mention, by the way, Father Andrew was a Piarist father, and he was or still is the vicar for education for his order in Africa. Or
yes,
yeah, and they run massive number of schools. Wonderful.
right. Yeah, my question is about the Catholic formation of Catholic teachers. I have my strong conviction that Catholic education depends largely on the Catholic conviction, on the Catholic education of Catholic teachers. And I am wondering how far or how much these teachers receive in terms of Catholic theology. We were in Fordham, we were at Fordham together, and in the curriculum we didn't have any course on Catholic theology, even when we were being formed to be teachers in Catholic schools. And so I begin to wonder how these teachers who are trained to be teachers in Catholic schools, how will they be able to strengthen the Catholic identity of the Catholic schools if they themselves do not receive any Catholic theological formation?
Good, very important. We're going to talk about this more in this segment next, but just to answer your question, first of all, I need to point out Father Andrew was a student of mine at Fordham, and he got an A. He was a very, very good student. But you see, up through the beginning of the 1960s, we didn't have to be concerned about the Catholic formation of Catholic school teachers for the simple reason that 80 to 90% of the teachers were clergy or religious. And the lay people who were part of the picture were brought along by, so for example, in the grammar school that I attended, we had 5 homerooms of every grade, and so there'd be 3 sisters and maybe 2 lay teachers. Well, the 3 sisters would do some kind of continuing education or updating of the education of the lay teachers. Well, when the bottom fell out in the 70s with the mass exodus of the nuns, there was a huge vacuum that was left there. And very often it was just total mass confusion, all right? Now, there's a huge difference between the lay teachers that were part of the process in the 70s and those who are with us today. I spend most of my time in airports giving teacher and clergy workshops, but what I tell teachers today, if I had said to those teachers in the 70s, I would have been laughed out of the room, right? That's not the case today. The average lay teacher in a Catholic school today is a committed lay Catholic, but lacking very often in some basic orientation that needs to be provided. And therefore, and I'm going to say this is another responsibility of the parish priest, right? To help provide for the ongoing theological and spiritual formation of the faculty. For example, once a month, an hour session with the faculty on some theological topic or some aspect of Christian spirituality or the liturgy, all right? So that we make sure that everybody's on the same page, all right? I find absolutely no resistance to any of that among lay teachers today. In fact, great appreciation for the most part. Right, sister? It's not the 70s. So if they don't know something, it's generally A, not their fault, and B, when it's presented to them, they generally gobble it up. They're enthusiastic for it. Right? Anybody else with a yes, Father Roman?
When you, Father Peter, asked Father Andrew about how many generations his family is Catholic. So I have some funny story just from my childhood. Because when I was a young child, there was always at home some pictures of my mom, my father, my sister, my grandma, grandpa, and, behind, more and more. So they always ask my mom, who is this? Who's this? Oh, that's a grandma, grandpa, great grandpa, that's your uncle. Okay. But later, next, but farther was the holy picture of the Last Supper. So I thought, that's my, family too. If you will ask me how many generations I'm Catholic, since Last Supper.
Very good. All right. Anything else? All right, let's take a bit of a break and come back at 7:45. And let's be on time. Otherwise, you need to get a late slip from Sister Elizabeth Ann.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.